Britain loves drinking.
I wouldn't mind another one of those.
Yet all around the country, pubs, one of the backbones of British culture, are dying. And last year, the number of pubs in the UK dropped to the lowest level since records began in the 1920s. When a once-loved institution starts to die, people are quick to point fingers, and the obvious scapegoat is, of course, young people. Along with their crippling addiction to avocado toast, they're also doing things like run clubs and yoga instead of spending their evenings drinking. While this seems like another convenient thing to blame Gen Z for, it doesn't really add up. And if we actually look at what's happening, we can see that this decline has been going on far earlier than when young people or even their parents were old enough to drink. So what's actually going on here? The obvious explanation is that people are just drinking less. But that isn't actually true. In fact, the average person today drinks more than they did in the 50s. The difference is they're just not doing it in pubs. If you were to ask Brits today why this is, they'll most likely say it's to do with cost. On the surface, that explanation makes sense. In the late 1980s, a pint cost around 90 pence, but today it's closer to £5. And that's being generous, as in London some even cost up to £9. But this is where things start to change. If we look a little closer, the numbers actually tell a very different story. Take a look at this chart here. It's basically tracking how affordable alcohol is in the UK, and instead of going down like you'd expect, it's been climbing. Since the 90s, week after week, booze has actually gotten easier to buy. In other words, alcohol has been getting more and more affordable, not less. That might sound like a contradiction. After all, during the same period, the price of a pint has almost quadrupled, way faster than wages have grown. But there's a slight catch here, which helps explain why pubs have had such a tough time. This affordability measure of alcohol only looks at the alcohol itself, not actually what you pay at the bar. Even though every company is talking about their special, unfiltered or sea salt beers, in reality, the drink itself only makes up about 5% of the cost of a pint. The rest goes on wages, rent, utilities, transport, and a big chunk, in fact the biggest, more than a third, is just on taxes. At the same time, selling alcohol has turned from a cheery local business of breweries into a brutally competitive industry. Pubs aren't just competing with each other, but now cocktail bars, off-licenses, supermarkets, and with that many options, even a small price difference matters. But this is where it starts to really hurt pubs. Normally shops add a 20% tax to what they sell. However, there is an exception. If something is sold at a loss, then that tax doesn't apply. Effectively, one of the biggest costs can just be eradicated. The idea was to protect struggling businesses, but big supermarkets found a way to turn that into an advantage. They often sell alcohol dirt cheap, even below cost, just to get people through the doors, knowing they'll make their money back on everything else in the basket. So while the price of beer in pubs has rapidly increased, the price in supermarkets has remained basically flat. Thanks to this, pubs have gone from a cheap place to buy booze to effectively a luxury product, and people are responding exactly how you would expect. Since the 70s, the amount of alcohol drunk at pubs has fallen off a cliff, while the amount of people consuming at home has been steadily rising. Being able to basically dodge taxes is certainly helpful, but there's an even bigger advantage that supermarkets have over pubs. They simply use the space a lot more efficiently, and in an era of skyrocketing rents, that efficiency is worth its weight in gold. A pub, by design, is full of dead space. In fact, it would seem kind of odd if it was a cattle pen. These wide aisles, large areas of standing room, and seating areas only filling up at peak times are certainly good for a vibe and cozy culture, but it's been pretty awful for their bottom line. A pub might turn out a few pints and meals per table over the course of an evening, but that's not a huge amount of revenue for the amount of space that actually needs to be rented out. Now, compare that to a supermarket, where every aisle is stacked floor to ceiling with food, household goods, and alcohol, shifting hundreds of units a day. As the cost of renting land has gone up, the ability to squeeze as much revenue as possible out of every square foot has become absolutely critical for any sort of business. The hard truth is that supermarkets are built for that kind of efficiency, and pubs aren't. The issue is the whole business model underpinning a pub was built in an era of cheap rents. When they first became fixtures of local life, land was relatively affordable, and you'd often find 2 or 3 on the same street, because, well, there wasn't really much else competing for the space. But as the 20th century wore on, Britain's population surged, growing by nearly a fifth in just a couple of decades. People rushed into the cities looking for work, and within just a few decades, the price of housing had increased by nearly 5 times. For pubs, the knock-on effect was brutal. In the late 1980s, the average landlord was paying around £7,000 a year in rent. Today it's closer to 37k. Margins that were already razor thin got squeezed even further, and today more than a fifth of the cost of a pint goes straight into covering rent. For lots of pubs, this simply wasn't affordable, and in the last few years, developers have swooped in, buying up pub sites and replacing them with housing they could flip for massive markups. Over time, streets once lined with pubs began to lose them one by one, and in towns like Maidstone, more than a dozen have shut their doors in the last year. Neighbourhoods that used to buzz with beer gardens and neon lights were left out with nothing but boarded up windows and for sale signs. And across the UK, nearly a quarter of pubs have closed in the last 15 years. There is of course just one issue with this theory. A growing population doesn't just push up land prices. In theory, it should also mean more customers in the pub, boosting profits. That's the natural mechanism that usually keeps businesses afloat. When more people move into a neighbourhood, there are simply more customers to go around, and that extra business usually makes up for higher rents. This is why rising land values haven't made barbershops or corner shops disappear. Everyone still needs haircuts and groceries, no matter how much their neighbourhood changes. But that balance only works if the new population actually uses the service, and in the case of pubs, that simply hasn't happened. Many of the UK's largest post-war migrant communities came from cultures where drinking is discouraged or outright forbidden. Islam forbids drinking entirely, while Sikhism and certain strands of Hinduism strongly discourage it. Even within Christianity, more conservative denominations arriving from places like West Africa often drink far less than the British average. And since the 1980s, the population of these groups has grown from about 800,000 to over 4 million, accounting for about a third of the country's population growth. That influx played a small part in pushing property values higher, but it didn't bring in more people through pub doors. And for many pub landlords, it was easier to sell up to a developer than to keep pouring pints for a shrinking customer base. Nowhere is this more obvious in places like London's Tower Hamlets and Newham. There, the Muslim population grew from under 5% in the 1980s to around 35 to 40% today, and over that same time period, nearly half of the pubs in the area closed. Looking more broadly across the country, the same trend starts to emerge. London boroughs with the largest growth in non-drinking communities, whether Muslim, Sikh or teetotal migrant groups, are consistently the same places with the sharpest decline in pubs. Mapped out across the country, the closures don't look random at all, and instead they tend to follow the contours of the demographic change. While it would undoubtedly be a dream come true for a certain UK politician to pin the closure of pubs on a certain group of society, this would be ignoring potentially the most important factor of all. People simply don't enjoy going to the pub the way they once did. 80 years ago, payday meant one obvious place to spend your money: the pub. In the 1950s, more than 10% of household spending went on alcohol and tobacco. Today, that figure is just closer to 3%. A lot of that is simply down to the fact that there's just loads more things to spend money on. Things like streaming services, holidays, and eating out. And at the same time, younger generations have shifted their priorities. Instead of spending evenings in shared places like pubs, more money and time now go into personal improvement. The gym, yoga, mindfulness apps, even side hustles. Now, this does follow a rising trend of the decline in spending power and actually being able to afford to go to the pub. But it's also worth remembering that one of the big social roles pubs used to play isn't really needed anymore. For decades, the pub was where you went to meet your mates, and of course, new people. A few drinks, a chat at the bar, and that's how a lot of relationships started. But dating apps, and of course social media, have totally changed that. Today, more than half of young adults in the UK have used a dating app, and around 1 in 3 relationships now begin online. The days of relationships starting at a bar are basically gone, and with it, the era of pubs seems to also be coming to a close. The point is, the decline of pubs isn't just about unfair pricing. Instead, it's come about for a whole host of reasons, from demographic changes to new technologies. And that raises an interesting question. Is any of this actually a problem? It's easy to look at pubs as an iconic, irreplaceable part of British culture, and in many ways they are. The pub has been celebrated in everything from literature to music to politics, and it's hard to picture Britain without it, but it's a mistake to think that culture is a static thing. 200 years ago, coaching inns were a cornerstone of British social life. They were the places where people ate, drank, socialised, and caught up on news while waiting for the next horse-drawn coach. Today, they've almost entirely disappeared, but nobody really mourns them. After all, they were replaced by something that fits the times better: railways, cafes, hotels, and eventually the modern pub itself. It may be that this trend is just the next logical step in that evolution, with pubs being replaced by things that people are actually prioritising: housing, restaurants, and gyms, maybe even entirely new spaces that we haven't even come up yet. That doesn't make the decline of pubs meaningless, but it would be a mistake to assume that it has to be a negative thing. Instead, it's a symptom of a world that is constantly evolving. While it's of course sad to be losing such a visible piece of tradition, culture has always adapted. There's no question that more pubs are going to start disappearing. The real question is, what's going to take their place, both in the buildings and their spot in British culture?